Hi, I'm Krista Menninga. So, what exactly is poverty? Poverty is defined as the state of not being financially stable enough to supply yourself with the basic needs to live. In 2017, a little over 22 million people ages 18 through 64 were in poverty. And of that 22 million, nearly 10 million were unemployed. The poverty line determines who is in poverty in the United States. This line or method was created in 1963. You take the cost of a minimal diet in the US, multiply that by 3. They decided to do that because the US family spends about 1/3 of their income on food. Again, that was in 1963. It's 2021, almost 2022 now, and nothing's changed. It's the exact same, so it's very outdated. The poverty line doesn't count the cost of electricity, childcare, transportation, and things like that. A social problem is defined as a problem that affects many people within a society. It's also a problem that people want to solve. Poverty is seen as a social problem because it leads to other social problems. It leads to crime and unemployment. People living in poverty commit crimes such as stealing in order to survive, such as stealing food from a grocery store because they can't pay for it. People living in poverty are also usually unemployed. So as poverty rises, so does the unemployment rate, which can impact our economy. So at high poverty, the high poverty rate hurts the nation's economy, which can impact everyone else as a result. Poverty also causes global inequality. There are a few rich nations, but many poor nations. There's no in between. Usually a nation is rich or very poor. Who's impacted by poverty? There's a higher poverty rate in families with single parents, especially with a woman single parent rather than a male. The poorest part of America is the southern region, with 13.6% of the southern region being poor. 44% of Americans living in poverty are children or the elderly. So almost half of America living in poverty are either elderly or children. And surprisingly, mostly whites are affected from poverty, with 42.8%. There are many effects of poverty. First, as I said, increase in crime, such as stealing. The next is homelessness. It's hard to find a home if you're living in poverty. And it's also hard to escape poverty without a home. So it creates this endless cycle where you are homeless, but you can't get a home because you're poor, but you can't get out of poverty. And then education. People living in poverty are less likely to go to college, that means they're less likely to get a high-paying job to help get out of poverty. There's also health problems. There's an increase in mental illnesses such as depression or anxiety. There's inadequate medical care because they can't pay for it. Inadequate nutrition because they can't pay for 3 meals a day. It also leads to family problems such as divorce or domestic violence. If you live in poverty, you're most likely to get a divorce. Sadly, I don't believe that there's one solution that will end poverty. I think that poverty will always exist, it'll always be there, but I do believe it can be reduced. And I believe it can be reduced through anti-poverty programs and policies. One of them, as it's listed, is affordable housing, or just more places for them to stay, more shelters. I also think that there can be better health services. I wouldn't exactly say that there should be free healthcare because I don't think that's possible in the United States. But I do think there can be better health services for the poor. There should be improved schooling. I know that, or expand early childhood programs. Some preschools you have to pay for, but some you don't. So I like the idea of not having to pay for preschool, because then those children can go and get an early head start on their learning. And if they improve schooling, then the people living in poverty are more likely to go to college, which will help them get a better paying job. Another solution is provide poor families with enough income to pay for food and housing, which I know that's there today. There's those governments paying for those poor families. A few more ways is to create more well-paying jobs that will give the families enough money to pay for food and housing. Some jobs provide paid medical leave and sick days. And lastly, there needs to be better pay equality in the labor market. I know that there's a gap between men and women. Men usually get paid more than women, and it's even worse for those of color. I think men and women should be paid equal, and that color shouldn't even be a factor in how much you get paid. From a sociologist perspective, sociologists believe that a way to reduce global poverty is to also reduce gender and ethnic inequality, which, like I said, men and women don't get paid the same. Men are more likely to have better opportunities than women. So to summarize, we talked about the poverty line, how it's outdated. We talked about how poverty leads to additional social problems such as crime and unemployment. We talked about how mostly whites are affected, with the 42.8% of whites being in poverty. We talked about the number of effects of poverty. We talked about those anti-programs such as improved health care and schooling. And lastly, we talked about reducing gender and ethnic inequality from that sociologist perspective. And there are my resources. Thank you for listening to my presentation.